Welcome. You're listening to The Hill by Thieves Theatre. I'm Gabriele.
I'm Nick, and we're thieves.
Yes, well, not exactly, but beginning in 1981, we called ourselves Thieves Theatre. But we didn't just do theater. We did conceptual guerrilla art projects, or what we call paratheatrical work. Our goal was to disrupt and alter the social and political status quo.
Which really means we just like putting sticks in anthills and watching the ants scurry around and readjust to their new reality, their new status quo.
So in the last episode, we touched on the idea of how artists here in the US constantly wrestle with obscurity on the one hand and with fame and fortune and celebrity on the other. And with Nick's and my relationship to that, how we try to negotiate that, as all artists do, I think, when neither fame or celebrity nor obscurity are desirable, right? I mean, I mentioned that what drew me to Nick, which I liked, the idea of back then, is that he said he didn't aspire to fame. He aspired to legend.
Right, legend. Well, I mean, I don't know how different from fame or celebrity legend is, but the idea is to escape from your name, to remain anonymous, to create a rumor around whatever you're doing.
Right, so they're bound to be somewhat similar, right? When the goal is to disrupt and alter the status quo. I mean, if you're successful, you're gonna get some attention, either as celebrity or as anonymous legend or rumor. You're gonna get attention, right? So there's a kind of, anonymity in legend. Right? An opportunity to make a mark on the world without your ego being right up front and center. For example, hey, look at that tipi. I wonder who built that and erected that. Versus, hey, look at me. And here's my contact information, right? So, of course, nothing is ever pure as far as our intentions go as artists. And I guess it's that impurity and vanity that ultimately is behind the guilt and mostly grief that we feel about what happened on the Hill and to Mr. Lee and why we put it away for so long. I was reminded recently of what Eric N., who was a classmate of mine and for a short while co-artistic director of Thieves Theatre, he once said that you have to weigh the power of creating art about the disease against creating a vaccine. In other words, against curing the disease.
Yeah, in other words, don't get so high and mighty and self-righteous about whatever action you're doing in art.
Right, but ultimately we are artists, and as theater people, we believe in the power of stories and what they can teach us and how they can help us live an examined life. So we go forth with humility now and telling the story of not just the Hill, but also what led up to it, to give it some context.
Right, but it's not going to read like humility, because it's almost impossible in the telling of it not to get all caught up in the excitement and sense of purpose that you had at the time. The sense of living large and the sense of righteousness that drove you to do it.
Well, you got to believe in what you're doing, right?
So in this episode, we're going to tell you about our production or our project, the Marat de Sade, which was in 1983 and 84 in Toronto. It set the stage, so to speak, for all our paratheatrical work that we did on the Hill, where productions put fiction, reality, or life, rumor, legend, all in one pot, so that you really couldn't separate one from the other. Which is why we'll also talk about here about Buffalo Bill's Wild West.
Yes, big inspiration.
Right. Wild West, not Wild West show, maybe the ultimate paratheatrical work that, in America, that, it had a real influence or a rendering of something to us.
Yeah, and in some ways it is a quintessentially American story, right?
Oh, yeah. Well, the wonders.
Yeah. Right. So anyway, we began the Marat Sade in Toronto in the summer of '83, just before my last year in grad school. And we called it the Marat Sade because it was an adaptation of Peter Weiss's play. It was Thieves Theatre's third production in Toronto, the first two being Cocteau's The Human Voice and Tom Ian's The White Whore and the Bit Player. Those were the two smaller plays that we did that we were kind of testing the Toronto waters with and getting to know the theater scene there. And then, the third play was The Marat Sade. The full title of Weiss's play is, Nick, take it away.
Yeah, it's 17 words, right?
Yeah.
The Persecution and Assassination of Jean-Paul Marat, as performed by the inmates at the Asylum at Charenton, under the direction of the Marquis de Sade.
Wow, very good. I think you nailed it.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think so. Okay, it was originally written in German, and it hard to encapsulate, but I think the best encapsulation I feel in 10 words or less or whatever is that it depicts the class struggle and human suffering, and basically asks whether true revolution comes from changing society or from changing yourself.
Well, yeah, I guess that's kind of the theme of it. But I mean, also, what is society's role and responsibility to the disenfranchised, especially here, the mentally ill, right? In the play, or today maybe. Of course, the theme is relevant later to The Hill when we started working with the residents.
Right, and it was relevant from our first play, Death Watch, Illinois State Penitentiary, right? Yeah, so as the full title suggests, the play takes place in an insane asylum. It's a fairly complicated construction because it's a play within a play. So Peter Weiss's overarching play takes place in 1808. The play within the play takes place 15 years earlier in 1793 during the French Revolution. It's performed, the play within the play is performed by the inmates of the asylum, and it's written and directed by the Marquis de Sade, who is also an inmate. And it culminates in the assassination of Jean-Paul Marat. The play within the play gets super chaotic, and sometimes the nurses and the supervisors have to step in and restore order, and the director of the asylum supervises the director of the play, who is the Marquis de Sade, of the play within the play, and it's chaos.
Yeah. Well, our production was just as layered as all that, but it had, I think, was more chaotic because it was real. I mean, not just more real, it was real. In other words, there was no pretense. It was basically a backstage brawl of the various factions in the ensemble, which are the punks, the actors, and the mental patients, and bringing them all, that backstage brawl, on stage and having that tension on stage.
Right. So the reality mirrored the play's reality, and like you said, it becomes even more layered that way, right? So the original play usually runs around 3 hours or so. Our adaptation, The Marat Sade, was about an hour long, and I translated it and adapted it. Well, we adapted it together from the German. We started to workshop the Marat Sade with an activist anti-psychiatry group of mental patients in Toronto called On Our Own. On Our Own questioned the philosophical and ethical underpinnings of psychiatry. The group was founded in 1977 and was the first enduring group by and for psychiatric survivors in Toronto. So after that workshop that summer in '83, I went back to school, and Nick stayed in Toronto and completed the production.
Yeah,
right?
And it turned out some of the members of On Our Own were also members of the punk scene that was going on inside Toronto.
Right, and punk was just then coming into full bloom in Toronto, after London, after New York.
Yeah, and we started basically editing the script around the lyric sections of the play with, Zero, the Wild Things, and Mike Nightmare, everybody writing original music for it.
Yeah, and don't forget Bunch of Fucking Goofs, maybe my favorite band name ever.
Yeah, well, right. But by the time we brought, the actual actors formally into the piece, the reality was that the rehearsal space had become, the performance space for the Wild Things, the Barf Puppies, and
Barf Puppies, right?
and Bunch of Fucking Goofs.
Another.
I mean, and the punk singer Zero, she was part of everything too. I wouldn't say we worked with these bands as much as we hung out with them. We'd go to their shows, and when we got there, we'd disrupt them like punks do. It was part of a kind of performance. It was performance art. The punk music scene was performance art. So we were trying to become our own punk-like entity. We had watched Mad Max, and the idea was to become like that gang in Mad Max.
Right.
So.
Yeah, you don't need it. You don't need it. I just realized you hadn't put your headphones on. Sorry for the interruption, but go ahead, continue as you were.
Now I can hear much better, I guess. Not really. I just hear like an echo or something. But we all watched that Mad Max show together, and we tried to imitate the gang that was there and try to become that gang. And everybody brought in their own costume to try to look like that gang.
Oh, yeah.
And we started wearing it,
Had a lot of flavor of Mad Max for sure.
Right, and we started wearing it as a performance thing, both during rehearsal, outside rehearsal, inside the punk, inside the after hours bar that we started later. But anyway, at first we hung at the Cameron House.
Which still exists, by the way, yeah.
But then we started the after hours bar, our own,
Right. So, and that after hours bar was started in conjunction with the Toronto Film Festival, which happens every year in September, and it's a huge deal. People take off work and to go see the films. The problem was I don't know if that's still the case today, but back then the bars closed at 1:00, and you can't expect people to go home after a film festival watching a film. You needed a place to hang out, to meet the celebrities,
and it wasn't. It was basically a rent party, right? The liquor sales that we were producing the Marat Sade, keeping us alive, keeping us be able to have the rehearsal space, the after hour, they were all the same thing. And this Marat Sade started to get a name in underground Toronto.
Right, and it was actually not really underground because the authorities turned a blind eye because they realized you can't expect people to go home at 1, But you used to go to Buffalo, I just remembered, right, to buy the liquor too, because that was kind of fun.
Oh, yeah.
Just to give a little taste of the history back then.
Yeah. I mean, it was very easy to cross the border, and all you needed was a driver's license to get there and back. No visa,
passport, like you do
anything.
today.
Yeah. So they didn't really scrutinize you. They asked you if you were carrying contraband, and you said no.
And they waved you through.
Right. I don't know what you do if they stopped you and caught you, but I don't think much.
Right. And liquor was so much more expensive in Canada. So you always did your liquor runs for the after-hour bar in Buffalo, right? In the U.S.
Right.
Let's see. So you had your liquor and you had your 2-story loft space. Go ahead. That you did the after-hour bar in and reversed.
Right. And the authorities didn't really bother you. All they did was find the bartenders, if they ever did anything, right? But the problem was they also confiscated the money and the liquor. So you tried to keep the liquor and the money, all the money you were making that night, on another floor or out of sight or somewhere where they couldn't find it, right?
Yeah.
So we hid. It was funny because we hid the money in a false floor on the second floor, but the false floor had no back on it, no back door on it when we were sticking it under. And so long after we closed the after hours bar, we were reaching under there with rakes and stuff, trying to find $20 bills or whatever, and we'd find them every once in a while.
Yeah. You found the $20 bills basically when Calman needed a new bottle of
Right,
Remy Martin, right?
Right. Kelman was one of the main conspirators and the producer of the show.
Yeah.
And
he was the one who rented that two-story loft
Right.
space, and he had various connections.
Some theater and some, I mean, a lot of theater, but
Sure.
some more shady kind of ones.
Okay, so we'll talk about him a little bit later, because I want to, he's very prominent in Marat Sade. But so one of the mental patients from the group On Our Own that was part of this production, his name was Tootsie. Tootsie, named after the film at the time. He was 6'5", 300 plus pounds. About 40 years old, I would say, curly, black, dyed black hair. He was the gentlest of giants, and all Tootsie wanted out of life, and all he ever talked about for the most part was he wanted a sex change.
Right.
Right.
And then every evening after rehearsals or performances later, he'd walk, I don't know, maybe it was 1.5 miles. I never knew where the halfway house was that he was walking
Not
back
exactly,
to.
yeah.
But he'd walk the 1.5 miles down Queen Street or King Street. And on the way there, he would take out a crayon and he would mark in all the wheat pasted posters, the Marat Sades are coming. So it eventually appeared on every poster.
On everybody else's wheat pasted poster, other events.
Right. And he also carried these 2 large suitcases in which he carried, he had all kinds of stuff in there, but the things that were important for the show were all the toy musical instruments he had, like a saxophone and various other kind of plastic instruments that he'd pull out all the time and start playing with the wild things. I mean, Mike Nightmare probably wasn't happy with it, but it was punk music.
Sure.
Tootsie added another element to the whole thing. And, except for like 3 performances at the theater center, 3 consecutive nights at the theater center, we never really did the Marat Sade play except in piecemeal rehearsals. And
right, which went on for months, by the way.
Right.
It started with the Toronto Film Festival. But the rehearsal process was...
As did the after hours.
Did the after hours.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, the whole thing was about
nine months, I would say.
Well, that includes the time we started it.
Right, the workshops.
So another 6 months or whatever there.
Yeah.
So
in total, I would say maybe 500 people actually saw the 3 shows.
Well, that's only if the Toronto Theatre Center. It was full each night. They had full audiences, but I don't think there were probably even quite 500 people.
Right, but the actual show only ran 3 nights, the actual play, right? And but you would have thought that with the after the fact notoriety the Marat Sade got through like hearsay and newspaper articles and radio talk shows and letters to the editor, you would have thought the whole city saw it.
Well, that's because the Marat Sade after hours site, with the rehearsal performance thing, was conflated with the actual Marat Sade play, which we barely performed. So the hearsay and rumor made one as one and one as the other. They conflated the 2.
Yeah, and it was controversial. I mean, some people said it's the best theater I've ever seen in my life, and other people said Nick Friccar should be ostracized.
Yeah, it was different. I mean, it was different from the start. The way we were approaching, it wasn't quite theater. It wasn't quite performance art. It was
very punk.
Yeah. So in that aesthetic, that we first formulated with Death Watch, where we were trying to bring the reality and the fiction together, it was now being cemented sort of with this production of the Marat Sade. A friend of ours was teaching at NYU at the time, and he asked me to come do a lecture on it. And in the lecture, what I tried to do, I told the story of the Wild Bill, Wild West, and conflated it with how we were
Buffalo
doing...
Bill.
Buffalo Bill.
Right. Not to be confused with Wild Bill Hickok.
Right, exactly. Another legend, right? How the Marat Sade was, how we use a similar approach to creating the Marat Sade.
Yes.
Right.
You researched Buffalo Bill a lot. In fact, you had got a great a great book on it, right? You researched that history extensively, and that's what led you to the idea of trying to get these NYU students to get better insight into the Marat Sade by giving them the example of Buffalo Bill, because it's also a story that very few people know. Buffalo Bill has an incredible history, including, he wrote the Pony Express and on and on and on. But the thing that's relevant here is the separating fact from fiction, which is very difficult to do with Buffalo Bill. He had a dime novels written about him by Ned Buntline, who himself was this crazy character. And Ned Buntline was actually a pseudonym, much like Buffalo Bill. Ned Buntline's real name was Edward Zane Carroll Judson Sr., and, go look him up. He had affairs with a teenage wife of somebody, and that husband went after him and shot him, and then Buntline was going to be arrested and hang and last second rescue from the gallows.
Yeah, and the Astor Place
riot.
The
Astor Place riot.
1849.
1849.
He was arrested as an instigator.
Yes, he was. And for those of you who aren't theater people, the Astor Place riot took place in New York. It was a huge deal. It was an actual riot that took place because of two opposing productions of Macbeth. If you can imagine that an actual riot could take place over theater production, but we won't get into that. But yes, Ned Buntline.
He also created the Buntline Special,
exactly.
Which is that long gun that Wyatt Earp and others used.
Right, the long-barreled handgun, right? And he claims he gave Buffalo Bill that moniker, William F. Cody. Buntline claims he named him Buffalo Bill, right?
Yeah.
Again, anonymous, legend, who knows what's true, right? So if you look at any of the historical posters for the traveling show that Colonel William F. Cody created, you see that the billing is Buffalo Bill's Wild West, not Buffalo Bill's Wild West show. Cody's contention was that he toured not a show, but the actual West itself, complete with, quote, real cowboys and Indians.
Yeah.
And they were.
And the representation and the difference, or the line between representation and reality or lived experience, was never clearly drawn inside this Buffalo Bill Wild West. The ambiguity gave this touring Wild West its power, its reality. Performance and lived experience was never clearly drawn. It was intertwined with one another.
Right.
The Buffalo Bill story gained credence from the fact that it actually had been lived, and in part at least, a claim that was not just made by Cody, but also by the Native Americans who toured with the Wild West with him, including Sitting Bull.
Including Sitting Bull, right. And so, all right, so many of the Native Americans who attacked the whites in the Wild West later left the reservation and, led by Sitting Bull, fought the whites in northern US and in Canada. And Sitting Bull figured prominently into the ghost dance phenomenon, which is what led up to the Wounded Knee Massacre in 1890, which is, of course, what our tipi was a memorial to.
So here we were looking at the ghost dance phenomena, and researching it 8 years before we even went up to the hill and put up the tipi. The story that I found so interesting there was that, here it was, the Native Americans were first fighting against the whites that were coming in, but then they went into the show, the Wild West.
Buffalo Bill's Wild West.
And then they came out of that show and then went back to fighting the whites again.
I know. It's
back and forth. So, the story I found most interesting when Sitting Bull came out of the Wild West show, Buffalo Bill had given him a horse, and the horse was from the show, was a trick horse. And the trick horse, when a shot was fired, was trained to sit back on its haunches and lift its front hooves up in the air and swing them. And what happened was they went to arrest Sitting Bull at the Pine Ridge Reservation. It was just about 3 months before some period of time like that, before the Wounded Knee Massacre. They went to arrest Sitting Bull, and there was a scuffle, and he got shot. The gun went off
and killed.
And they hauled him off, but the horse sat up on its haunches and did that trick where it was waving its front hooves. And of course, all those that were participating in the ghost dance thought the horse was doing the ghost dance.
Right. Yeah.
And
So some of the Sioux who attacked Custer at Little Bighorn later joined Buffalo Bill's theater troupe, right, and attacked him nightly in the Wild West show tour in England. Buffalo Bill took this entire horses and this huge show on to a ship and crossed England and crossed over to England and toured it. I mean, that I always found that kind of mind-boggling.
The most dramatic incident though
Mm-hmm.
has to be of this interchange between theater and life is the Yellow Hand incident,
Right.
or it became known as that.
It became known, yeah.
And
So in June of 1876, Buffalo Bill left the stage in Wilmington, Delaware, where he was the star in a touring melodrama called, sorry, I can't talk today, The Prairie Scout.
written by Ned Buntline.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Really?
Yeah.
I didn't know that. That's hilarious. It's all coming together. So he left that show to take an actual commission as an actual scout, again, back and forth, right, with the 5th Cavalry. He was in the field, not with Custer, but at the time, he was in the field at the time of Custer's last stand. And in a battle that July, Buffalo Bill killed and scalped the warrior Hioway, which was translated at the time as Yellow Hand. So thus the Yellow Hand incident, right?
Yeah, the engagement their fight was staged, of course, and meaning that instead of the whites sending in their army and the natives sending in their tribe to fight, they decided to fight between two people. So they sent, Yellow Hand. The Cheyenne sent Yellow Hand, and the 5th Cavalry sent Buffalo Bill.
Yeah.
So Yellow Hand was, of course, putting on his war makeup before the fight. Buffalo Bill was putting on his stage makeup, as well as putting on his stage costume, his showman's costume that he wore in the theater. And Buffalo Bill killed Yellow Hand.
Yeah. I don't know, I'm sorry. I just keep thinking it would be so great if all wars were fought that way, right? Send one of your bravest warriors, let them fight it out, and the end. All right, whatever. So unbelievably, the next year, a melodrama called The Red Right Hand, or The First Scalp for Custer, not written by Ned Buntline, I presume,
No, probably not.
starring Buffalo Bill, toured the country. So each night, Buffalo Bill killed Yellow Hand in the same theatrical costume and makeup that he wore in the actual battle where he killed the actual Yellow Hand. So repeatedly in theaters across the country, he took the first scalp, quote unquote. The actual scalp of Yellow Hand was on tour with the play and on display in the lobby, so they say, right?
Yeah, I mean, is that fact or fiction? I mean, did the actual scalp exist? If so, wouldn't it still exist? I mean, did Buffalo Bill actually scalp Yellow Hand?
Yeah, let's start with this fact versus fiction. Let's start with the fact that Hioway actually translates into yellow hair. So the yellow hand incident is actually the yellow hair incident, but if you look at books, it's not known as that in history. So is there an actual scalp? And if so, did it have yellow hair?
Right. So in this lecture at NYU to the students, I was linking Buffalo Bill's Wild West with our Marat Sade production, and showing how fiction and lived spirit experience were intertwined with each other.
Yeah. So I want to get back to Kalman for a second. Paul Kalman was a partner in Thieves Theatre with us in producing the Marat Sade, and he's also the one who originally rented the space, for the after hours bar, and had all the connection, as we mentioned. And so, as an actor, Paul had achieved some success, some celebrity. As a leading man in a few films, most prominently, he played the lead TJ a couple years earlier, in 1981, in the cult classic My Bloody Valentine, which was a huge deal among cult horror fans. It is a huge deal to this very day. Paul remained a dear friend until he died a little over a year ago. And he had stopped going to conventions, My Bloody Valentine conventions, because of his illness, but he was still signing autographs and sending his signed headshot out via, by mail. So he had a career to the end of his life based on My Bloody Valentine.
Yeah, but when we started producing Marat Sade, the reality wasn't just the production of Marat Sade, because it was the building which had which had antique furniture, which Paul and I would haul down to the harbor on weekends to sell at the antique market. It had a fashion store that the punks brought in their homemade studded clothing and stuff to sell. And it was, it was all one thing. We lived there, of course, too, Paul and I. Mm-hmm. And so it was all just, the building was the Marat Sade with all these different businesses, quote unquote, attached to it. Paul's history in acting, though, was mostly in the theater, alternative theater. That's where we found a lot of the actors that came in. He worked for Theater Passe Muraille.
Great name.
Right.
Perfect name for us.
Yeah. Theater Beyond Walls, right?
Yeah.
And Kelman was a mover and a shaker. And when he attached his ambition to something, everyone knew that the theater piece was going to be a success. Or not a success, maybe, but it was going to be something.
Yeah, just as surely as everybody knew that the after hours bar and the fashion clothing store and the antique furniture business would all go bust sooner rather than later.
Or get busted, likely.
Or get busted,
yeah,
right.
So the punks in the Marat, I said they brought in their studded clothes, right? And Kelman sold everything on commission. So if somebody sold, pair of pants, he'd get half or whatever. And same thing with the furniture that was brought in. And, the store never really paid the rent. None of the enterprise really did. Although the furniture coming in helped a lot, but we never had money to give back the commission on the furniture that we sold. So it was always trying to give to Peter from Paul, that saying, you pay Peter with blah, blah, blah. And so they come in trying to get their money, and we'd say, you can have anything in the store,
Yeah.
And so it sort of worked. People sort of understood that we didn't have the money, and we weren't trying to
bilk them. No.
We just didn't have the money.
In the end, everybody got what they needed out of it,
And then in the end, it was from, borrow Peter to pay Paul until There was just Paul.
There was just Paul
Kelman. Right. I mean, there was nothing crazy or dishonest about doing business like this. I mean, it was just a different, more fitting, more I don't know, venture for the Marat Sade.
Yes,
right?
and a more fitting venture for Thieves Theatre, right? I mean, which wants to put sticks in anthills and disrupt the status quo of how you do things in the world and not play by capitalism's rules.
Well,
you
yeah,
know,
I mean,
a game that you can't win when you do things on the level that we're trying to do them.
well, I mean,
You
yeah,
know?
at that level, I think sometimes good theater has to be bad business. I mean, more precisely, the big site-specific arena of capitalistic system, right, doesn't really have or doesn't give any value to something like the Marat Sade, so you have to reinvent the values and the means of barter, and in a kind of temporary autonomy.
Yes,
So
yes.
it's not going to last forever.
No, and here's the important part to me, right, is that it also dismisses the voices and the knowledge of individuals like Tootsie, like Mike Nightmare, or the inmates of Illinois State Penitentiary, or the people in the shantytown, for example. Those people cannot find a voice and make themselves heard in the status quo system, right?
Yeah.
So Mike, for example, right, he told this story once of how he escaped a mental hospital.
Right. We had found him through On Our Own, the anti-psychiatry group.
Exactly. He was part of On Our Own. And he found himself still fantasizing at the time about stalking and kidnapping and torturing the psych doctor that he had, who ordered his electroshock treatment. He fantasized putting jumper cables from his car battery to his temples. And
yeah, right.
Right?
Mike was something. He had this deep, crackling kind of voice when he sang and when he talked. I mean, everybody said that, when Mike Nightmare walked into a bar, and he had a face too, that everybody said, that's a face you want to punch. He was that kind of guy, right? And I mean, the good doctor and Mike were probably very lucky that Mike Nightmare found the wild things and a temporary autonomous zone like the Marat Sade to sublimate and stage the rage that was inside him.
Yeah.
Because instead of, perpetrating it out on reality.
The rage, exactly. Yeah. And that is the function of theater, right? Of art. The function is catharsis, sublimation. And as you said, Nick, in the last episode, it's like that boxing ring where the street fight and the war are kept at bay, contained, right? And so Peter Brook gave the definitive production of Marat Sade. Peter Weiss's play was written for an audience similar to the audience of the play within the play, meaning the genteel 1808 Paris, intelligentsia and upper crust that watched the inmates of the title perform. So site-specific, in the case of Peter Weiss's play, was the Royal Shakespeare Company, one of the grandest, most highly subsidized theater, Western culture, or Kultur, as we Germans say, has to offer.
Right. And we found a counter culture equivalent to that site-specific venue. And that was the Marat Sade in Toronto. I mean, the punks represented part of that, and the actors in an alternative theater scene, another part. And Tootsie and On Our Own mental patients represented still another. So it was, if I call to mind a defining image of what I get from Marat Sade, it really is, I think it's Tootsie saying goodnight to me after, the opening night performance. And, and he's picking up his 2 suitcases and he's walking to his halfway house down King Street there. And, to me, he looks larger than life, a larger than life hero. And I just think of him walking alone with those 2 things, facing his life. But then I realized that on the way there back, he's probably still going to write on the
The
last,
Marat Sads are coming.
yeah, on one of the last posters on there. And then, then I start to laugh. And, I realize that he's not really heroic or larger than life. He's just crazy. But I mean, he's crazy the way the rest of us were in that show.
Yeah, crazy.
And crazy and larger than life than the rest of us were. All of us were in that show.
Yeah, Tootsie. I regret not spending more time. I would go there on weekends or whatever when I had long weekends, and but so I wasn't really part of Marat Sade. But one thing I'm grateful for is to have gotten to know Tootsie. He's will forever be
and more than
an
anything,
inspiration, right?
And more than anything, I think he's the legend
Yes.
of the Marat Sade. If the Marat Sade is the legend, it's Tootsie.
Exactly. So that is the legend of the Marat Sade. In the next episode, we're going to take you back to New York and ABC No Rio, and we'll be talking about the final site-specific, zeitgeist-specific production that led up to our work on the Hill.
You want to talk about No Rio? How you found the?
Oh yes. Okay.
How you found out the name?
Oh yeah.
I mean, you found it out for both of us.
For both of us, yeah. We'd already mentioned ABC No Rio, and I just don't want this to get lost because I'm very proud of it. It was like this epiphany that I had. Nobody ever really talked about how ABC No Rio got its name. They didn't tell you, but when you discovered it, you felt amazing. So I was standing on the stoop outside of the building, looking across the street, probably smoking a cigarette, on break from some rehearsal, and there it was right in front of me. Across the street was an old, fading sign in Spanish for a lawyer's office. Abogado notario. The O was half missing, so that's the C. Gado was gone. No, the rest was gone. Tari was gone. Rio, no, Ta Rio. So ABC No Rio was all that was left from Abogado notario.
Right. And that's where we did my play early in 82 or 83, whatever it was. And then we came back with the Trash City and Death.
Right. So Trash the City and Death, which we'll talk about next time, was a highly, highly controversial play written by Rainer Werner Fassbinder, who's best known, of course, as a filmmaker. There were 4 failed attempts to mount the play in Germany, including by Fassbinder himself. Volumes of critical analysis were written about the play, the consensus being that it was unproducible.
Yeah, in 1987, Thieves Theatre staged the world premiere, sparking a kind of international attention and debate over it. Yeah.
Right. So that's next time. Thank you for listening to The Hill by Thieves Theatre. And if you like what you hear, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the bell so that you know when our next episode is out.
And check out our website at thievestheatre.org, where you can also buy Gabriele's book. And follow us on Instagram and Twitter at TP on the Hill. That's TIPI on the Hill.
Yahoo! Thank you.
Thanks for listening.
Till next time.